Somewhere in the North Atlantic, in the year 985 AD, a red-haired exile looked out from the prow of his ship and made a decision that would echo across 5 centuries. He had already been thrown out of Norway for killing a man, then thrown out of Iceland for killing 2 more. He had nowhere left to go except west, into waters that no map described and no sailor had returned from to recommend. He found land, an enormous island, mostly ice, at the very edge of the habitable world. And then he did something that may be history's first marketing scheme. He called it Greenland. Erik the Red, Erik Rowdy in the old tongue, was not a subtle man. He was a farmer's son, twice exiled for violence, and he understood something fundamental about human nature. People go where they are told things are good. So he returned to Iceland after 3 years of exploration and told people that the land he had found was green, fertile, a paradise waiting to be farmed. He did not mention the 9 months of ice. He did not mention the polar bears. He did not mention that the growing season was so short you could miss it by sleeping in. It worked. In 985 AD, a fleet of 25 ships set out from Iceland carrying an estimated 500 settlers, men, women, children, livestock, tools, seeds, everything needed to build a new society from nothing. 11 of those 25 ships were lost at sea on the crossing. 14 arrived. Those 14 ships and the people on them would found a colony that lasted for nearly 500 years. Their descendants would build stone churches, send sons on crusade, trade with European merchants, pay tithes to the Pope in Rome, and establish one of the most remote outposts of medieval Christian civilization the world had ever seen. And then, sometime in the mid-1400s, every single one of them disappeared. No one knows why. No one even noticed when it happened. The Norse Greenlanders built 2 settlements along the southwestern coast of the island where the fjords cut deep enough into the land to create sheltered valleys with something approaching soil. The eastern settlement, the larger of the 2, eventually grew to contain nearly 500 farms. It had its own bishop and cathedral. At its height, it housed an estimated 4,000 people. The western settlement, several hundred kilometers to the north, held another 1,000 or so. These were not primitive camps. They were functioning communities, connected by sea to the trade networks of medieval Europe. The Norse Greenlanders exported walrus ivory, a luxury product worth extraordinary sums in European markets, as well as furs, rope made from walrus hide, and live polar bears, which wealthy European nobles kept as status symbols. In return, they received iron, timber, grain, and the manufactured goods that life in Greenland could not produce. They were, in every sense, part of medieval European civilization, just at its furthest and most improbable edge. They also, this far north in the 10th century, crossed to North America. Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red, reached the coast of what is now Newfoundland around 1000 AD, 5 full centuries before Columbus. The Norse called it Vinland. They tried to settle it. The indigenous people they encountered, whom the Norse called Skraelings, drove them out. They went back to Greenland and stayed there for another 450 years. In 1124 AD, the Norse Greenlanders received something that marked their full integration into the medieval Christian world, their own bishop. The bishopric was established at Gardar in the eastern settlement. A stone cathedral was built, stone, not turf, the mark of permanence and ambition. The Pope himself corresponded with the Greenlandic Church. Tithes were collected and sent to Rome, which meant that the head of the Catholic Church sat in his palace in Italy and received money from farmers living on the edge of the Arctic Circle. This is what the Norse Greenlanders were, not Vikings in the popular sense, not raiders, not warriors pillaging monasteries. They were Christian farmers at the outermost margin of the known world, living lives not so different from Christian farmers in Norway or Denmark, except that their margins were thinner, their winters longer, and their distance from help immeasurable. At the height of the colony, around 1200 AD, those 5,000 people were prosperous enough. The walrus ivory trade was profitable. The farms, though marginal, produced enough to sustain life. Ships came from Europe regularly, merchants, clergy, the occasional Norwegian royal representative. Then the climate changed. The medieval warm period, the climatic anomaly that had made Norse settlement of Greenland possible in the first place, began to end around 1300 AD. Temperatures across the North Atlantic dropped, slowly at first, then faster. Pastures that had fed cattle for 300 years began to fail. The growing season contracted. Hay production, the foundation of their livestock economy, became increasingly unreliable. A bad summer meant not enough hay. Not enough hay meant animals died over winter. Dead animals meant no milk, no meat, no hides, and a community with nothing to trade. At the same time, something was happening in European markets that the Norse Greenlanders could not have known about and could not have controlled. African elephant ivory had begun flowing into Europe through new trade routes. It was cheaper than walrus ivory, easier to work, and came in larger pieces. The market for walrus tusks, the primary product that had justified the entire Greenlandic enterprise in European eyes, collapsed. The ships began to come less frequently. Here is what is remarkable, and what historians have only recently begun to fully appreciate. The Norse Greenlanders did not simply sit and wait to die. They adapted. Bone evidence from archaeological sites shows a dramatic shift in diet across the 13th and 14th centuries, away from cattle towards seal meat and marine mammals. They built smaller, more energy-efficient buildings. They changed their farming practices to conserve the diminishing hay supply. They hunted walrus not for trade, but for food. They dug irrigation channels to capture what little rain fell. They moved their settlements to take advantage of whatever shelter remained. And they refused, stubbornly and fatally, to fish. This is one of the strangest facts in the entire Norse Greenland story. Greenland's waters were, and are, full of fish, Arctic char, cod, salmon. The Inuit who shared the island survived for millennia in part because they were master fishermen. But the Norse dug up refuse heaps. The middens where they threw their food waste contain almost no fish bones at all. Fishing was apparently beneath them. It was not what farmers did. It was not who they were. And their identity, European, Christian, agricultural, may have killed them as surely as the cold. Around 1350, a Norwegian priest named Ivar Barderson was sent from the eastern settlement to check on the western settlement to the north. The western settlement had stopped sending reports. Ships that had sailed north to trade had come back with unsettling accounts, or had not come back at all. Ivar Barderson arrived at the western settlement and found it empty. Not destroyed, not burned, not the scene of any obvious catastrophe. Simply empty. The farms stood, the church stood, the livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, were still there, wandering the abandoned fields. The people were gone. Ivar Barderson wrote about what he found, and his account has been one of the most debated documents in Norse history ever since. He blamed the Skrælings, the Inuit. He suggested there had been violence, a raid, an attack that had driven the Norse out, or killed them all. But there was no evidence of that. No burned buildings, no mass graves, no weapons scattered in the ruins. Just absence. Total and inexplicable, and the cattle standing in empty fields as if waiting for owners who were never coming back. We found no men, neither Christian nor heathen, only some wild cattle and sheep. Ivar Barderson, c. 1350 AD. Where did they go? The honest answer is nobody knows. The theories are numerous. The most dramatic is that the western settlements Norse were wiped out by the Inuit, and there is some Inuit oral tradition that describes conflict with the Norse, but the archaeological evidence does not support a violent end. The most likely answer is also the saddest. They left. As conditions worsened, as the farms failed, as the supply ships stopped coming, the Western settlement's Norse populations slowly drained away, some sailing south to join the Eastern settlement, some attempting the crossing back to Iceland, some simply dying one winter when there was not enough food and not enough warmth. There was no single event, no last battle, no dramatic ending, just a slow attrition, a gradual leaking away of people until one day there was no one left, and the cattle wandered the empty farms in the Greenlandic wind. The Eastern settlement continued for another 100 years. On Sunday, September 16, 1408, a wedding took place at Holsay Church in the Eastern settlement of Norse Greenland. The bride was Sigríður Bjornsdóttir. The groom was Thorstein Olafsson. They had arrived in Greenland accidentally, blown off course while sailing from Norway to Iceland, and made landfall and found themselves guests of the Norse community there. They stayed for several years. They fell in love, apparently, or arranged things appropriately, and in September of 1408, they stood in Holsay Church, a stone building whose ruins still stand today, the best preserved Norse structure in Greenland, and were married. The ceremony was conducted by priests according to all proper Catholic custom. The wedding was witnessed by the community. It was later recorded in letters sent back to Iceland, and those letters, 3 of them, written between 1409 and 1424, are among the last documents to mention Norse Greenland at all. The couple left Greenland with the same ship that had brought them, arriving in Iceland in 1410. They brought letters from the Greenlandic community, ordinary correspondence, the kind of thing people sent when they had news to share. The letters contain no hint of crisis, no mention of famine or disease or fear, no suggestion that anything is wrong. A community is going about its business, celebrating a wedding, sending letters home. That is the last anyone heard from them. After 1410, nothing. No more letters, no more ships, no more records of any kind. Europe, in the decades that followed, was consumed by its own crises: the Black Death's aftermath, the 100 Years' War, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the political upheavals that would eventually produce the Reformation. Greenland, always peripheral, became invisible. When European ships finally ventured back to the Greenlandic settlements in the late 1400s and early 1500s, they found ruins. Empty farmhouses, collapsed church walls, cemeteries with their carved Norse headstones slowly sinking into the permafrost. And those cemeteries told a story that the written records could not. The graves had grown smaller. Not in the sense that the headstones had shrunk, in the sense that the people buried in them had. Skeletal remains from the final decades of the Eastern settlement show evidence of severe malnutrition. The adults were shorter than their ancestors, significantly shorter. Their bones showed the characteristic markers of chronic food shortage. Their teeth showed vitamin deficiencies. The children's graves became more frequent. These were not people killed by a sudden catastrophe. These were people who had been slowly starving, generation by generation, watching themselves diminish, unable to stop it. They did not flee. They did not call for help. They simply ceased. For centuries, historians and archaeologists have debated what ended the Norse Greenland colony. The honest answer is that it was not one thing. It was everything at once, each problem making the others worse in a cascade that took decades to complete, but was, in retrospect, impossible to survive. The first killer was climate. The Little Ice Age made farming progressively harder across the 14th and 15th centuries. Shorter growing seasons, harder winters, less reliable hay production. The entire agricultural foundation of the colony was being slowly eroded by forces nobody understood and nobody could control. The second killer was the ivory market. When elephant ivory replaced walrus ivory in European markets, the Norse Greenlanders lost their primary source of income. The ships stopped coming. Trade goods dried up. Iron, which they could not produce themselves and which was essential for tools and weapons, became scarce. The third killer was isolation. As ship traffic declined, the colony became genuinely cut off. Problems that a connected community could solve, a disease, a bad harvest, a shortage of a particular material, became catastrophic when there was no external help to call on. The fourth killer was drought. Recent geological research has found evidence of severe, sustained droughts hitting Greenland during the Norse occupation's final decades. Drought, on top of a cooling climate, was a combination that even the most adaptable farming community could not absorb. The fifth killer was pride. The Norse refused to learn from the Inuit, who lived beside them and who knew from millennia of accumulated knowledge exactly how to survive in this environment. The Norse would not fish. They would not adopt Inuit hunting techniques. They would not build in the Inuit way. They were Europeans. They did things the European way, and the European way was killing them. The sixth, perhaps the most devastating, was sea level rise. Recent research suggests that ocean levels around southern Greenland rose by as much as 10 feet during the Norse occupation's final decades, inundating the productive farmland near the fjord mouths. The fields closest to the water, the most fertile, the most sheltered, the most productive, went underwater permanently while the Norse were still trying to farm them. Here is the one fragment of hope in this story, and it is a small one. Archaeological and skeletal evidence from Iceland and possibly mainland Scandinavia suggests that some Norse Greenlanders may have gotten out. In Iceland, researchers have found skeletal remains and genetic markers that point to individuals of Greenlandic origin arriving in the 14th and 15th centuries. DNA analysis of modern Icelandic and Greenlandic populations continues to add pieces to this puzzle. The most recent and optimistic reading of the evidence suggests that the colony did not simply die, that at some point the remaining Norse Greenlanders gathered what they could carry, loaded onto the ships they still had, and sailed east. They arrived somewhere, Iceland possibly, Norway, as refugees from a world that had ceased to exist, survivors of a 500-year experiment in the limits of human endurance. If they did, nobody wrote it down. Nobody said, "Here are the last of the Norse Greenland, come home after all these centuries." They arrived quietly, if they arrived at all, and were absorbed, and were forgotten, which is its own kind of erasure.
The Norse Greenland colony has been called by modern archaeologists one of history's most important case studies in societal collapse. And that framing is correct, but it is also, in a way, unkind. It reduces 5,000 human lives to a lesson. It turns centuries of births, marriages, prayers, harvests, storms survived and not survived into a data set. The people who built Hvalsey Church, who carved their names into headstones now sinking into permafrost, who sent letters home about weddings and ordinary life, they were not a case study. They were people who got up every morning and tried to survive, the same way people everywhere have always done. They failed, or the world failed them. The distinction matters. What is certain is this: the Norse Greenlanders were not stupid. They were not inflexible in every way. They adopted more than historians once gave them credit for. They changed their diets, their buildings, their hunting practices. They held on for 5 centuries in a place that had never been designed to hold them. But they could not change fast enough. And the changes they could not make, the cultural and social ones, the willingness to become something different, to learn from people they considered inferior, those were the ones that killed them. There is a final, quiet devastation to the Norse Greenland story that deserves mention. For centuries, the permafrost of southern Greenland preserved the physical evidence of their existence: bones, clothing, tools, organic material that would have rotted away anywhere else. Archaeologists working in Greenland over the past 100 years have uncovered extraordinary things. A woman's hood from the 14th century, so well preserved you can still see the weave of the fabric.
bone samples that yield DNA for genetic analysis, food remains that tell us exactly what the final generations ate and how malnourished they were. But the permafrost is melting. Climate change, the same force that helped destroy the Norse colony 600 years ago, is now destroying the evidence that they ever existed. Organic material that survived 5 centuries in the frozen ground is rotting in years as the temperature rises. Archaeologists describe it as a race against time. The story of how the Norse Greenlanders died is literally disappearing under their feet, consumed by the same warming world that consumed the colony itself. Just at the time we can do something with all this data, it is disappearing under our feet. Why they were erased. There was no conqueror who needed to erase the Norse Greenlanders, no victor who rewrote the history books, no empire that demanded they be forgotten, no church that suppressed their memory. They were erased by silence and ice and distance and indifference of a Europe that had moved on to other preoccupations. They fell off the edge of the world, as the world had always feared they might, and nobody came looking. The Inuit remember them. In oral traditions that have been passed down for centuries, there are stories of the Kavlanite, the Norse, their farms, their cattle, their ships, their eventual disappearance. The people who survived the Arctic remember the people who could not. What remains of the Norse Greenlanders is this: some ruins at the edge of fjords, a few hundred graves with the bones of people who grew shorter and smaller with each generation, a handful of letters about a wedding, and a silence that has lasted 600 years. The last record of them is a wedding. 2 people in love, or 2 people making a practical arrangement, standing in a stone church at the end of the world, probably not thinking about history at all, just standing there in the September light, saying their vows, while somewhere outside the wind came off the ice. We do not know what happened next. We may never know. That is what it means to be erased.
If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. It helps more people find this channel, and it keeps these stories coming. Up next is the city at the edge of everything. See you there.